can you speak a little bit to the power of storytelling and why this is a skill leaders and organizations who want to truly make an impact should be investing in and honing?
Storytelling helps us to remember things better rather than getting tactical instructions on how to shoot an arrow. Hearing a story about a great archer, it packs all the same information in a far more memorable way. And that's just the way we as a human species are wired. As an evolutionary purpose, storytelling and creative play serve to the species is social cohesion. If we have a shared story that we're all bought in on, we're all going to vie for and fight for our piece of living that story. If a story can do that for the species, imagine what it can do for your brand. How is your organization living that story? How are you pushing that story out to the world?
What does it take to do the impossible? What does it take to level up your game like never before? What does it take for individuals, organizations, for even institutions to achieve paradigm shifting? Nothing is ever the same again, breakthroughs.
Our mission is to decode the neurobiology of flow and cognitive peak performance. Access the minds of maverick scientists, groundbreaking innovators, and world-leading experts to understand what it takes to achieve ultimate human performance, so you can feel your best, perform your best, and accomplish your boldest goals. I'm your host, Rian Doris, and together with best-selling author Stephen Kotler, I present to you Flow Research Collective Radio.
Josh, welcome to Flow Research Collective Radio. Thank you so much for your willingness to hang out with us today. Welcome.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Tori. Thank you for having me. This is great.
This is going to be awesome. Josh, I'm so stoked to have this conversation with you because in addition to the fact that you're the founder of an incredibly cool company, Duck, you also started training with the Flow Research Collective back in 2021, which makes you one of our, OGs. And you're an alumni of Zero to Dangerous, of Flow for Writers, for High Flow Leadership, now known as Climbing Mount Bold. So there is so much fertile ground for us to cover together. So let's dig in.
I have drunk the Kool-Aid. Let's dive in.
It's tasty. It's tasty. What can we say? So we like to kick off our client spotlights in a similar way because we like to showcase people's massively transformative purposes to really illustrate the incredible ways our community is impacting the world. So I'd love to start off with, what is your MTP?
I love that question. Thank you very much for asking. And my MTP is actually to shape and share stories for social impact. And so that speaks to both my career as a writer and then my career as a creative consultant running an agency. So, yeah.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit about, for those of our listeners who don't know you, how is that MTP related to what you do at Odd Duck? Tell us a little bit about that.
So first of all, the MTP actually pre-existed Odd Duck. So that's an important note. But so Odd Duck is, we are a storytelling for social change communication consultancy, focused primarily in the health area. We drive on that in three main ways. The first, which hopefully Tori will actually elaborate on a little bit throughout, but the first is strategic storytelling. So that's for organization. How do you get internally all your team on the same page with the same story and the same narrative playbook? And how do you push that story out disruptively to upset the prevailing narrative, the existing paradigm, and use storytelling to shift that? So that's the first thing that we do. The second thing is that we do a lot of stories ourselves. So we collect a lot of stories. We do a lot of comic books, interactive platforms, again, all around a social change component and all around using narrative as a driver for that. And then the third is just, doing one-on-one coaching, usually with executive directors or solopreneurs, scientists, and shaping and sharing their stories. So I've worked with well over 100 scientists on kind of getting out of that research mode where you're always, and I'm sure I'm preaching the choir here, but you're always removed from talking about it, to getting more comfortable saying, this is why I'm passionate about this. This is why I started doing this. And then I've also worked with coaching at least half a dozen TED speakers. and in that space. So those are the three ways that we sort of drive on that. And my position is actually founder and chief narrative strategist of On.
So incredibly cool. And we're definitely going to be double clicking on the power of storytelling and so many of those different pieces. Yeah, I mean, amazing stuff. So let's pull back for a second here. And since you are a storyteller, you know I had to do this. I want to hear your flow origin story. So so what set you on the path to flow and then ultimately to training with FRC?
So I have sort of two entry points into telling this story, and I don't usually tell them in conjunction, but I'm gonna start with one which was actually like 20 years ago, and the reason why I'm sharing it with this audience is because I think I've shared this with some folks in the community. I made a lot of the mistakes that a lot of like hard charging flow junkies make. Right. And so FRC actually helped me correct those. And so the first part of the story begins like I said, 20 years ago. I was an undergrad in psych, completely different life, completely different existence. I was trying to finish my degree really fast because I had a job waiting for me and I had already signed a contract. And so that job wasn't going to be waiting if I didn't finish my degree in a certain amount of time. So I was under a lot of pressure. And a friend of mine, and I think they were trying to subtly tell me something with this, but a friend of mine said, hey, look, you can earn 3 credits in one weekend, Friday to Sunday, just by taking the stress reduction and relaxation workshop.
Just a subtle nudge. Just a subtle, like, there you go.
There you go. So I was like, oh, okay, 3 credits in one weekend, relaxation and stress reduction right over my head. I was like, oh, awesome. 3. I can't get that anywhere else. I'm in. Okay. So I sign up for this workshop. It is taught by somebody else whose personality is sort of wired the way I feel like a lot of the FRC folks are wired. So he had is Dr. J.P. Dave, and he had a PhD in theology, a PhD or a PsyDoc in psychology, and then a PhD in existential philosophy. So, really underachiever there. He was in his 70s at the time, right? And he was running circles around us 20-somethings, doing yoga, doing Tai Chi, introducing us to all these things. So this weekend was game changing in a lot of ways. I learned formal meditation practice. I was introduced to Qigong for the first time, which is a practice that I continue with today. I was introduced to flow and to the concept of flow because Dr. Dave had actually trained under Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and had been a student of his in the psych program. So I learned about all of this, but I really learned about it in a sort of academic way, right? So even though I was ironically in a relaxation and recovery workshop, I didn't take some of those lessons to heart.
Sure.
And so I had a tendency over the next 2 decades professionally to really go hard at subjects that I was interested in, that I was invested in, and that I was passionate about, and then work myself to burn out, and then fall into a depression for a few months, come out of the depression, and start the whole process all over again. And I did that for probably about a decade, right? And then, I don't know if we have to go too deep into it, but I was misdiagnosed as having bipolar 3 times during this process, because some of the symptoms seemed so reminiscent of that disorder, right? And so finally I was like, okay, I need some sort of neuropsychiatric like evidence one way or the other, whether I'm bipolar or there's something else going on. And through that, I learned that I was attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So didn't have like a full-blown mood disorder, but I was behaving using some of the hyperfocus with ADD in a way that was reminiscent or emblematic of, bipolar. And the missing piece, and so this is where FRC comes in, right? So coincidentally, at the time that I was getting this kind of diagnostic and learning about this, at the time, I was working for a neuro psych facility, and I was helping both train and coach the neurologists, the psychology, psychiatry staff, and sharing their story, as well as writing the newsletter and trying to find a compelling way. And so I was asking around for a solid science writer who just really, made stuff sound exciting, right? And so I was asking, a friend said, "Oh, you know what? You'll really like this dude, Stephen Kotler. He's sort of like punk Malcolm Gladwell." And I was like, all right, I'm in. So what I like to say, Tori, is that I came for the style and I stayed for the content, because I picked up a copy of Rise of Superman, loved it, was like, how do I get more? And I actually signed up. This shows how much of an OG I am. I signed up for a course. I believe it was A Habit of Ferocity through Mind Valley, which it was teaching, which was a precursor to everything that FRC is doing. And one of the things, and this is a through line that connects all the stuff that I learned with Dr. Dave, with all the stuff that I've learned from, you and the FRC team and everything, is that recovery piece, right, is absolutely essential to that hard charging piece, right? So like
Completely.
it wasn't like that, just learning that cycle, just that alone changed my life. And that's not an exaggeration, right? Changed my life forever.
I love that. I love that story. And look, I think that it's just incredibly relatable too. I mean, as one of the coaches at FRC, I hear some version of that so regularly, because hard charging people are taught to rest and recover. It's just not, I don't think it's a natural part of our DNA. And so truly it is a paradigm shift to think of recovery as part of the work. Recovery is not doing nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like the oscillation concept was a key takeaway for you,
100%.
for sure.
100%.
And something else I want to kind of highlight too, because I think a ton of people come to FRC with this similar kind of puzzle piece too, which is the ADHD piece. And I get the question all the time of, is this going to, limit my ability to access flow? And really, it can end up being a superpower because of the hyperfixation. But to your point, you need guardrails, or it's a surefire ticket to burnout. So can you talk a little bit about, we talked about oscillation and using recovery, but any other kind of guardrails that you've put in place to where you can still get into flow, but you're not staying in it for the amount of time where then you're just totally wiped and drained of resources?
Yeah. So there's a couple there. I think, just heading to the calendar, keeping on your calendar and organizing things that way. I don't do as much of the I keep to kind of doing blocks of deep work, and then trying to keep my meetings and my one-on-one conversations and stuff till later in the afternoon, after I've gotten some writing out of the way or something like that. So those are practices that don't come naturally to somebody without executive functions, right?
Sure.
Who cognitively lacks those executive functions. But, again, these are tools that I'm like, oh, I could do this. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, and this was like manna from heaven, is non-time. Just doing a practice of non-time. That has absolutely been, because I think there's a tendency, and this is part of the, Tara Brach, who is kind of meditation. She's like a psychoanalyst and a meditation instructor. She talks about how when she first got into doing yoga and stuff, she was like, I'm going to out-meditate all of you. Right. And again, that's a very FRC tendency, right? Like, I feel like a lot of people can relate to that. Like we look at it and we're like, I'm gonna be so down in my downtime. There's never been anybody this down. Right. And so like there's a tendency to do that. And I think non-time is, again, it's sort of like, oh, you can just take little sips. Like, you don't have to drink the whole glass. You can make it through your day. And if you give yourself a little padding before and after each meeting, that might be enough. That might be enough to carry you through like a very packed day. right? And so those were things, I think a lot of what FRC has done has given me some of that permission to be like, hey, you know what? It's cool if you slow down. It's going to be all right. The work's still going to be there, right? And a lot.
Truly. Yeah, I love that. And I also had to learn the very hard lesson of like, you can't win at yoga. That was something that I had to learn. That's
Yeah.
not real. It's not how you do it.
Yeah, right.
So, and I want to stay here for just a moment longer because I hear so regularly, you know, when we're starting to develop calendar worshiping practices to really optimize that calendar for flow, I hear very regularly from people, I'm a creative and this is not how I work, right? Like this is too structured. So I love that I'm talking to you, who you are an incredible creative. That is exactly your life, right? And I'm hearing that non-time is this really powerful thing to schedule. So for people that don't know what that is, can you describe non-time a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah. So non-time is just literally blocking out time, blocking out pockets of time where you do, as instructed, nothing, right? Or something that is completely off topic from any of your work activities, right? And it feels, especially when you start, it feels a little frightening, feels like a little like, oh my God, this is such a waste of time. But the benefits after doing that like consecutively are astronomical. And just in headspace alone, right? So that was a big non-time. And I'm so glad you brought up the creative thing, right? Because that is absolutely, that is one of those tendencies that internally, like my inner artist and my inner ADD artist really tries to like resist and fight against, is like, oh my God, we're planning our week before the week's even happened. Who does that? It's like, well,
Thank you.
yeah, like, but again, and it feels like somehow you're depriving yourself of the spontaneity. So without being too like mystical about it, there's a prevailing sense that you're somehow undermining the opportunity for like magic to happen, right? By having a calendar of events, right? And what I would say is the opposite is actually true. Like, to be completely blunt about it, when you have your shit locked down, magic does happen, because it frees you up to see all of these patterns that you wouldn't see otherwise, because you're usually, if you're not doing the calendar worship piece, if you're not minding yourself, you're usually like, okay, what do I have to do today? And how do I have to do that? And what do I have to get prepared for this presentation, or da da da? And then it's taking up so much bandwidth that, you're not getting this opportunity of like, oh my God, I just met, the author of this book and they have this up, and you just see things in a way that's a lot clearer, and the connections are a lot clearer than if you don't, right?
No, completely. And I think that, yeah, to your point, if you haven't locked in, the things that you need to get done, if that you don't have clarity there, then you end up spending precious cognitive bandwidth on low value decision making instead of saving it for the magic, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing, and that's the other like sneaky bit about it, right? Is that you don't notice that you didn't have it until you do. Right. Right. So.
Completely. And that's, I urge people, run for like the straitjacket effect of like, I don't want a calendar. This is too restricting. It's run the experiment and then just see how you feel. And to your point, I think that I'm really glad that you brought up non-time, because to me, that's really an opportunity to protect a whole area of time for you to get divergent, for you to get creative. Yeah. And, sometimes, I urge clients, use that non-time just to think about one or two really important questions. Let yourself just kind of think it through, spend some time with it without any distraction. It's just such an impactful way to build that cognitive surplus. Right?
And what I would add to that too, and you can tell me if but like, what I would add to that is also like, don't be married to the answers, right? So set yourself up with the question. I think that's a great way to like tee everything up. It's really, it helps you kind of go deep. But like, sometimes the answers that I've gotten in now making this a regular practice have been about problems that I didn't even know I needed to ask about.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by part of that being like the magic, right? I will be working with a client and we're trying to, put together a production of something. I'm like, oh, I need this guy who's an illustrator. I need this person who does, and I'm trying to do this. And then like all of a sudden something else that I'm not even focused on for another client or another project or something that I'm working on personally will just spontaneously emerge because I'm open to it, right?
Right. Right.
So, yeah.
No, I think that you bring up an important point of non-time is not supposed to be dedicated to a certain outcome or result. It's just thinking time. And so I think it really challenges you to fight that urge of, okay, I have a question and now I'm rushing to the solution space. It really encourages you to stay in the problem space, get divergent, really explore. And like you said, it opens you, right, to so many different potential possibilities.
That's literally that. Like that was one of those things that when I started doing it, I did it wrong. I was doing it like, I'm like, okay, like, and then like you would finish like, and you'd be like, my non-time didn't work. I need a refund because my non-time didn't work. I don't have the solution, but it's like that short circuits the whole process. There is like an element of just openness and just being like trusting the process, right? Like I'm going to do this thing. And, at a certain point, like, even if I don't have the exact answer that I'm looking for, the exact answer that I need, I'm going to have, it's like, I'm going to have freed up the space to actually find it, right?
Truly. And so you're, I think, illustrating one of my favorite things about training with FRC, honestly, is that through the process, you actually redefine what you see as productive. Recovery and rest, it's actually very productive. It's incredibly productive.
Yeah.
Spending time just getting divergent and allowing yourself to explore potential and different possibilities, really explore the problem space. That is productive, right? So I think, and there's such a huge ROI on making that change, right? Expanding what we think is being productive, right? So with that being said, I've heard some different things from you, so I'll let you take the wheel here, but I want to hear a little bit about, from making all these changes, what has been kind of your ROI from training with FRC, and also just how does flow show up for you? And those may be two separate questions.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the first thing that I'll answer, and I mean, I don't think it's been like when I talk about having that recovery piece, seeing that cycle and how that cycle has contributed or benefited my life, like literally that's been life-changing at like life-changing to begin with, but like literally saved my life in a lot. Okay. Like that was transformative. So that alone, like, whoo, that alone was worth the price of admission. But then to add to that, I would say, just the relationships with the community, the people that I've connected to or connected with in the community, just on a personal basis. I think FRC, there's something about the folks here who are some of the most fascinating people that in the world, really. I mean, honestly, in the world, just the community is just amazing and constantly inspiring. But then from an economic perspective as well, I've had a lot of clients through FRC and through the community or through referrals that came through it. So I've actually, what I'll say, Tori, is and I've done the work on it. So if you look at just the techniques themselves, but then the techniques in combination with the actual contracts that I've gotten from some of these relationships, I've more than 3 times paid for what I've invested.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. So
that's nuts.
And like, I think that bears repeating. I'll just flat out say, I mean, like, beyond just the techniques, if you do the math, if you look at it, I made 3 times what I actually put in. So that is, I don't know anything else that has, at least, I don't know anything else in the training world that has that kind of ROI, right?
Me neither. Me neither.
Yeah.
Let me know if you find out.
I'm still looking, but no.
No, that's incredible. And I also want to just emphasize, how you started things off, that it's not just about financial return. It's not just about productivity. It's about learning how to work and lead, right? Because you have a whole team in a way that's healthy and sustainable. Like
100%.
that's gigantic. That's gigantic. So with that in mind, let's get a little bit, because I always get this question from clients who are starting off in Zero to Dangerous. What does accurate deployment of flow look like for you? How do you kind of look at your day and decide, this is where I want to get into flow, this is what's going to be highest impact? How do you do that?
Yeah. So a lot of, and it's interesting to be having this conversation now, Tori, because some of this is really shifting for me as my team grows, as the organization sort of expands, which is something, we can talk about actually, because it's something that's covered in some of the coursework. But what I'll say specifically is for, I really do kind of put an emphasis, put a premium on those activities like writing, like or just story craft, world building, sometimes world building on behalf of a client. That is such deep work and takes so much focus and attention and energy that I now have to set aside, and now actively set aside time to do that, to focus on that. I have my blocks of writing time, or my blocks of, if it's on behalf of a client, to actually work on, their kind of narrative framework and invest myself in that. Whereas I think the way I was, trained professionally was sort of, you fit you have your deadline coming, and you fit those in the little pockets in between interviews and meetings and whatever. And you just sort of cobble this together. And so the thing that happens, right, is, you're robbing yourself of the opportunity to truly go into flow with the work. If you're like, okay, I only have, whatever, an hour to work on this until my next phone call. And then and then after that phone call, I have to run this meeting, but then I can get back to the project, and hopefully I'll get in flow when I get back to it. But if I don't, then, then after the call after that, I will definitely, right. And so by setting aside the time to actually immerse yourself in the work, it allows you to kind of tap in and channel kind of that flow energy and really do that. And then, again, being the ADD with the hyper focus and everything, and the blinders, sometimes I have to set alarm. I mean, I have a lot of alarms going here. So that's the only thing that's going to pull me up, right?
So I think that, and I'm glad that you went there, because I was just going to ask you kind of, let's get for a moment just really tactical, because I think that so many people struggle with this, where you are a leader, you have a team, you're running a business, but you also really do need time for flow because you have creative work to execute on. So I'm hearing alarms are helpful. So really sticking to time blocking and pulling yourself out of flow. Also, maybe not doing other things until that alarm goes off. Any other kind of tactics to share? Because this comes up all the time.
Yeah. Well, there's a concept that's sort of in the Climbing Mount Bold, that's talked about sort of the moving from musician to conductor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, so as a writer, I often say it's sort of like I fell backward into being a business owner, right? Because it was like I was writing and I was getting so much work as a writer. I was like, oh, I need more of this stuff, and I need to figure out this budget thing, and I need to do, how do we do, so and then the next thing, I'm running an agency, right? So that is a very common story I think it's a very common story just for entrepreneurs in general.
Yeah.
Right. But what happens is you sort of shift into now I'm a conductor, and so I'm leading this team. I have, copywriters and artists and so on who are working with me or for me or collaborating. And so I have to, spend a lot of time and energy on them. And so part of that is a shift in how you look at your reward system, right? And this is actually like, I have a funny story about this, but this was like a big shift for me when I was going through the coursework. If I could share this.
Yeah, please.
So we're working on this big project with this client. We're creating a toolkit, and then like a guide. We have like, so I bring in my graphic designer. I have 2 junior writers. I have a copy editor. So we have like a full team, and we're giving this presentation about what this will accomplish, and why we want to do this narrative framework in this way, and da. And so as we're going around, this is actually a little bit embarrassing to admit, but I think it illustrates the point, so I'm willing to go there. So I have I have my writer, and she's phenomenal. She's very talented. She's a journalist, was trained in journalism and switched and does like a lot of the creative writing too. And she's very adept at that. So she's giving, that my graphic designer gives her piece about what everything's going to look like, and the aesthetic and the brand and everything, very exciting. And then we move on. And then like my, and I'm like, oh, yeah, go. Yeah, yes, you did it. Okay. And then like, we get to that, and then like my junior writer is talking, and she's like, okay. And then like, I really want to shape the story this way. And here's the thing for her. And like, but I'm like getting jealous. And I'm like, why am I getting jealous?
Yeah.
I'm getting the kudos. It's my company. Like, why, but I'm getting jealous that the client is giving, my writer props, and like, I'm like, oh, I want those kudos. I want those flowers, like, and so it was just really like, and obviously this didn't, I'm externalizing a lot of internal drama because nobody's aware of this, right? My team's going to listen to this now and be like, oh, is that what's going on? But anyways,
So like, that's what that tantrum was about. Wow.
exactly. So, but like that was the thing. And then I actually had a conversation with David, who's an FRC coach. He was my FRC coach and I was sharing this with him, and he's like, well, this is textbook sort of musician to conductor, right? Like,
Sure.
because and the thing that he illustrated for me is like, so much of both my ego and the reward system of my ego is tied up with writer, that I was kind of getting stuck there and not recognizing that like the big picture project and the outcomes there, which by the way, were incredibly successful. So spoiler alert. But like by placing kind of the motivation and my attention there and focusing there, like that's where like the future rewards need to come from. Right. And so that was a very dramatic shift in mindset. And it's something that I've now seen play out in lots of different situations, lots of different like professional contexts. And it's definitely a transition that's still in process, but it was a very eye-opening event. I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but
I think that it's deeply relevant, and we're definitely in the neighborhood. And I think that you're bringing up a huge piece. I mean, because my question was, how do you really preserve deep work time to execute while you're also running a business and leading people? And I think what you're telling me, what I'm hearing is that you have to get specific about what is yours and what is not yours in your business, right? You have to move from musician to conductor. It might mean that you play the instrument sometimes, right? And that's your deep work time. But if you lack clarity on delegation and really supporting your team and being a conductor of that team, then you end up with no flow at all, right?
That's right. And some of that delegation is actually trusting the people that you've hired to do the job, do the job, right? Because again, there's a tendency for those of us who are wired in a certain way to be like, okay, well, I know how this is supposed to play out. So let me just take over for a little bit and I'll show you. Right. And so again, that's depriving your team of the opportunity to learn. It's depriving yourself of the opportunity to get in flow. And it's also depriving yourself of, like letting somebody do the job you hired them to do. Right. Like, So being able to kind of take that step back and say, okay, like I'm gonna delegate, I'm gonna trust, in my judgment of hiring these people. I'm very fortunate that I have a gatekeeper who kind of helps manage my schedule. And if people want to get on my schedule, like she's the first line of defense in figuring out. So it's like, like I have one acolyte for my calendar worship.
But sometimes you need that. Sometimes an accountability device is hiring a person to do that for you,
100%.
right? So then you're not making that decision. No, I think that's huge. I think you're really just highlighting the power of spending time figuring out how you're going to transition from being the musician to conductor, because you're absolutely right. If you're in this position, it's probably because you're a really good musician, right? And you probably could do it better than other people, but that also is going to create an insane bottleneck and stopping from scaling your business in any meaningful way.
And it has repeatedly, there's a lot of stuff that I had to learn the hard way, because that was exactly it. And it was one of those moments of the scales falling from my eyes when I was like, oh, like I'm the common denominator in all of these projects.
I'm the problem. It's me.
Like,
Yeah.
Whoops. Exactly.
Yeah. And I love your work on, okay, but why? Because I think that is not a space that a lot of leaders spend enough time in, is why am I not delegating this? Yeah. Double click it. And I think a lot of time, part of the reason is, it's part of my identity and I feel really validated and I understand who I am in this organization because I do this thing really well. So there is a transition period that can be really uncomfortable as you start to reshape that. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, that's exactly it. And there was like a real kind of exploratory process, because I feel like if I had just left that to its own devices, right, the default would always be to go back to the musician.
I'll just do it.
Yeah, I'll just do it. Or I know how to figure this out. So, I've got it covered. Right.
Yeah. The struggle is real. I was working with another client in climbing Mount Bold recently, and he came to the table after he was running this experiment of, empowering his team and not jumping in to take over when things started to go wrong. And he said, I'm learning that I need to let the fires burn a little longer, right? Like you can't rush in to it. So me too. You can't rush in to put the fires out. You have to let the fires burn, because that's what's going to give your team that ownership, right? And it's a group flow trigger for some accountability and ownership and autonomy to actually solve it themselves. And that builds trust.
That's 100%. And I would say that there is like a flip side. So like I shared with you the slightly embarrassing and awkward, revealing, like meeting that I had. But I've had like flip side meetings since then, where same team or similar team, and we're doing, similar things, but the difference is when I'm sort of, okay, like I'm comfortable in my conductor seat, right? Like there is like a group flow energy to it. There is like sort of a connectiveness of like, oh, this is where okay. And like, this person's like anticipating where I'm going with this and like just stepping in, and so you kind of feel that energy, and it's really exciting. It's a big shift.
Truly. And I think, if we look at it in context of the flow cycle, right, we're talking initially about there's struggle here in this transition, but ultimately flow is around the corner if you stay the course and architect this, right? Yeah. No,
that's it. Yeah.
So kind of in line with now taking more of this conductor role and being a leader, being a founder of an organization, I want to know a little bit, because we talk a lot about separating strategy from execution. So how in this process of training and evolving to be this conductor has goal setting, kind of your approach to strategy, changed?
Yeah. So the first thing that I'll say is my timeline has shifted dramatically, right? So in writer mode, you're really only thinking, like I was really only thinking like one assignment to the next, or one project to the next. So a lot of times you're just week to week. You're thinking about, how are you going to, like, how am I going to help solve this client's problems? But a lot of times you're also thinking of like, how am I just going to solve these problems on the page, right?
Yeah.
And so everything has like a very kind of narrow window. And one of the things that sort of shifted through this engagement is that, the time horizons got a lot longer, and I've been able to, and, I think, but I've been able to do things like, like, oh, this is a 2025 project. Like I see where I'm going with this. Whereas before the impetus would be, I have 5 awesome opportunities in front of me. I'm going to try to do all 5 at the same time. And sure, they'll all crash and burn, but, from the ashes, I'll have something slightly cool.
It's going to be so exciting though. Yeah.
It's going to be so exciting. It's going to be so amazing. So, and the descent as I'm crashing and burning is going to be glorious. So, right,
so let's try it. Yeah.
Let's give it a go. Right. And so, like, again, going back to like kind of giving yourself permission for things, it's like, okay, well, if this is a good idea now, this could, and sometimes it's that there's an inevitable, like, oh, like, there's a reason why you have to pursue this now, because now is the opportunity. I get that. But there's also a lot of things where you're creating a false urgency just to give yourself an excuse to kind of jump into the driver's seat, right? You're like, oh no, I have to pursue that, because no, you don't. Right.
I just want to pause you there, because I think I hear this all the time from creative people who are entrepreneurial. They have a million really exciting ideas, or another exciting opportunity comes their way, and they say yes. And to your point, it's almost never a successful plan, right? Because they're spread way too thin. Their resources are spread out, way too dispersed. And the recognition that people who are entrepreneurial tend to over-explore, right? They don't land the plane because the dopamine, the serotonin comes with the new ideas and they're sexy, and landing the plane is inherently less sexy, right? And so it's really hard to stay in that implementation mode to actually land the idea fully. So I love that you're connecting this to, okay, and now I strategize differently. So go on, please.
Yeah. So that's it. And I just to kind of, because that you teed up a thing that, like, I think is worth exploring, is like, I love planning. Like, even as an ADDer, I love planning. It's like, I used to say, like, oh yeah, the planning is great, the execution not so hot, but the planning is great. Because, like you said, there is all sorts of chemical hits happening in your brain when you're planning it. And, the best part about it is you don't have to take the risk and you don't have to do the thing. You can just do the planning, and there's plenty of reward there, right? And then when you actually do the thing and you run into all the challenges, right? You're like, oh man, this is not nearly as fun as the pre part, right?
Now we're in the struggle, not fun.
Right, exactly. But like, part of this whole journey, kind of going over the last like 10 years, one of the things that I had sort of said to myself of, like, I would know when I arrived, was when I started being one of those people who woke up in the morning, rolled up their sleeves, and was like, what kind of problems are we going to tackle today? Right? Like, because I've always seen those people and I've been like, like, that's amazing that they can do that. I'm not that person. Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I've had to learn, and one of the things that FRC has been instrumental in helping teach me, has been that tendency, has been the being able to, like, not be reserved about the problem solving aspect of it, because that's also often not awesome. It's also awesome, but it's often the thing that I feel like creates the block to the execution part, right? You're like, it's just so much safer to stay in planning mode, right? But then when you get to the other side of it and your plan is executed, and maybe it doesn't come out exactly the way you all the steps are exactly the way you laid it out, but you land in a place where you have this incredible output. You're like, oh my God, I built a thing. This is the thing I built. And it, like, that reward is so much better than anything that the planning stage can even prepare you for, right?
Yeah, I love that. And it feels like you're speaking to the fact that the struggle is far less daunting because you have these different tools. And also, I think just a different perspective that struggle is inherent to the flow cycle. It's not something like, oh no, I'm on the wrong track. Actually, you're on the right track.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I feel like oftentimes you would, but I would get into this thing of like, feeling like, oh, if I'm experiencing this resistance, if I'm experiencing going to the writer thing, if I'm experiencing that anxiety of the blank page, and I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do with this cursor, let alone, the words that I'm supposed to, like that it's supposed to queue up, then I've exactly like you said, I've done something wrong. Like and
Yeah.
in reality, it's like, well, that's just sort of the tick, 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 tick when you're on the roller coaster, right? That's going to get you to the top where you're like, whee,
I love that visual because I actually ask people that on a regular basis. So picture yourself sitting in front of that blank page, ready to do that hard thing that you've been putting off for the last week, and you're looking at that blinking cursor. What do you do in that moment? And most people, when they come into the program, it's, I go make myself a 4th cup of coffee for the day. I pick up my phone. I go show
my email. Yeah.
And it's like, oh, you're resetting the flow cycle. Stay the course, right? So I love the visual of the roller coaster. Like you're just on your way up. Stay there.
Yes.
Fantastic. That's fantastic.
That's absolutely, and that's, going back to the block of time and the alarms, right, that we were talking about earlier. And I think like that's another aspect. So the alarm is helpful in pulling myself out because I'm like, oh, okay, the alarm went off. I have to shut this down and get ready to do, to run my meeting or to talk to my team or whatever. So that's one thing. But the other purpose is the tick, tick, tick part is, I'll be like, oh, I got to make myself a cup of tea, or I got to make myself a cup of coffee, or I got to check my email, or I got to, I wonder if this, fire is how this fire is going or whatever. And then I'll be like, nope, I have to sit right here and do this thing until this alarm goes off.
Yes.
Right.
Perfect.
And so that just changes the dynamic. Right. So.
I hope people that are listening to this are like, I immediately need to start doing this because I think it's just a fantastic strategy because you're taking all of the decision making out of this situation. Keep doing the thing until you hear the alarm. Should I do? No, the answer is no. Stay.
Yeah, right. Like, and like those distractions, even the ones that are just in your head, are so sneaky and so persistent. And you're like, oh yeah, no, that's a pretty compelling reason for why I have to check my email right now. No,
simple rule. Yeah, you're wrong. You're wrong.
You're wrong.
That's fantastic. I love it. Okay, so I want to make sure we get to our storytelling piece because this is your genius, and I want to share it with all of our listeners. So I wrote down the Odd Duck mission statement because I think it's really powerful. So I want to share it first. So the Odd Duck mission is that Odd Duck discovers, shapes, and shares transformative stories for impact-driven organizations working to improve a world in urgent need of change. So, like I said, you're an expert storyteller. And storytelling is actually a skill that we talk about quite a lot at FRC as well. So can you speak a little bit to just the power of storytelling and why this is a skill leaders and organizations who want to truly make an impact should be investing in and honing?
Yeah. Okay. So I can answer both for individual storytellers as well as for organizations, because
Please.
I think there are things that storytelling as a tool can do to benefit both. So the first, just kind of talking about organizations. Brian Boyd, who is he did one of the most comprehensive evolutionary analyses of literature and storytelling. He goes all the way back, and the question he's asking throughout this large tome of anthropological book is like, why, when our people are starving and we're primed to be eaten by a or about to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, and we have to look for shelter, we have to look for food, and did our ancestors be like, it'd be great, I'm just gonna dick around and play or paint on this cave wall or sit here and tell this story? Like, that seems so counterintuitive. So what is going on there, right? Like, what is going on in that space? And the thing that he explores all of these reasons, and there are a myriad of reasons. Storytelling helps us to remember things better. So rather than getting tactical instructions on like how to throw a spear or how to shoot an arrow, like hearing a story about a great archer, it packs all the same information in a far more memorable way. And that's just the way we as a human species are wired. But number one reason that he finds as far as an evolutionary purpose that storytelling and creative play, serve to the species is social cohesion. That's it. That's what's up right there. That social cohesion piece, right? Because if we have a shared story that we're all bought in on, we're all going to vie for and fight for our piece of living that story, right? And so I always say, like, to my clients, like, if a story can do that for the species, imagine what it can do for your brand, right? So,
Massive.
right. So that's the piece for the organization, and a large part of that is both getting your entire team on the same page, sharing the same story, living from the same story. So how is your organization living that story? The other part of that is how are you pushing that story out to the world? And so that's that disruptive story piece that I was talking about earlier. So if you have, all of our belief systems for the most part, as a whole, are made up of narratives, and narratives are shaped by every piece of media that we're sort of exposed to in one way or another. And some of those narratives can be, on point and accurate. And some of those narratives can be completely misinformed and misguided and not serving us as a species or a culture or society or as an organization. And so what I often invite my clients and challenge my clients to do is figure out, well, what are the entry points? How can your story disrupt that broader narrative, right? And a lot of that is just exploring, what is that narrative framework? How are we telling our story to disrupt that, right? So that's from an organizational social change perspective.
Incredibly powerful. And as you're talking there, it kind of it queued up for me research from JJ Van Hout, who does a ton of research on team flow. And we talked about individual flow. Individual flow is amazing. Group or team flow, even better. And one of the most important predictors of a group being able to get into team flow is creating something called collective ambition. And for that, we have to have that social cohesion. We have to meet at what is our mission as a special team. And I think, to your point, storytelling is the fastest, most effective way to create that sense of collective ambition. So insanely powerful, high impact tool.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. And so the other piece of that is for as an individual, as individual change agents, as ambassadors or champions of causes, or just being an individual who wants to share their story in the world. One of the things that I've found is it's not, there's a tendency to sort of have three main sort of components in the typical story that individuals tell. And those components are usually sort of like my personal piece, then what the issue is / what the research says, and then this call to action. And the mistake that I find most people make is they tell it in that way. It's sort of the outline that you did on the school paper in your persuasive essay in 8th grade, where you're like, okay, I really got to teach my classmates to buy these shoes. So I'm going to persuade them, whatever. Right. And so like we have a tendency to think of like in those blocks. And so here I'm going to share my personal story and then I'm going to share this. And what we found being far more effective is what I refer to as the braided effect or the braided approach. Right. And that is literally you're taking these inflection points from your life, you're combining them with the research or the issue or the cause that you're trying to advance. And then you have a call to action for how the audience can meet you in that story and carry it further. And then you're weaving those things together. And so to oversimplify the point, that those are the things that are more effective because what you're doing for your audience is you're inviting them along with you on a journey.
Right.
And so you're bringing them sort of up and you're showing them what's possible. And then you're bringing them back to the reality. You're bringing them up and showing them what's possible and bringing them back to the reality. And you're weaving all of those things together as you go. Yeah. So that's from an individual position, individual standpoint. That's what we found is the most effective technique of storytelling.
And I think that I think that's a super helpful kind of framework for as people are listening to that and thinking about how can I integrate storytelling into what I do or how I lead, right? That's I think that's a more powerful framework than the 8th grade shoe selling essay formula. So
a lot of pain, I think the two mistakes that I find often, so like one of the more comprehensive things that we do in an organization is help an organization not just to have its own narrative framework, but to create a culture of storytelling. So what does a culture of storytelling look like? Well, the success of a culture of storytelling is when you have people who aren't even associated with your brand or just tangentially associated with your brand, telling stories about, oh, this is the XYZ way of doing it. So I worked with an architecture firm, and one of the stories that came up when we were doing the story jam, which is an activity that our team will do, we were meeting with leadership. And one of the guys was saying that, what was incredibly thrilling for them was when, they had come on a job site and it was, the general contractor was telling other people, well, we usually do things this way because they were so used to doing this sort of boutique, kind of, or not boutique, sorry, these sort of standard approaches. And this was so boutique and so unique that they were like, oh, and then the general contractor said, well, that's the way these guys do things. It's like, oh, this is their studio's way, right? If you can get whatever the equivalent is for your field or your industry, if you can get people telling stories that's your way of doing things, then, you've achieved like something that like is an extremely like if I'm going out and advocating the FRC way of doing things, which I often do, right? Like that is far more valuable than somebody who's paid to tell that story or paid to share that piece, right? So in creating these cultures of stories, it's often identifying what is the why, what is the motivation behind sharing this story, right? And secondly, is there a way that we can build this in? So are there ways that even in our team meetings, we're sharing experiences that happened over the weekend that reinforce our brand or reinforce the values of the organization, right?
Exactly. And I mean, and there's just a wealth of neuroscience research to show too that more areas of the brain are going to be activated when you're conveying information through storytelling than this more kind of didactic, dry approach. So I love your nudge for people to think about how could you even infuse meetings with this approach, because you're going to get so much more social cohesion. You're going to get so much more interaction, engagement from that technique than, the standard dry,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So before we go here, we started talking about your MTP, and any good MTP creates limitless motivation because at some level it's insatiable, right? You never actually get there. So I want to hear. So what's the next chapter in your story? What's next for you?
Sure. So the big thing, as I said, Odd Duck is growing. So we're
Congrats.
Thank you. I'm also, we have a book, or I have a book due out next year by Roman and Littlefield, a publisher, focused around community violence interventions. So it actually tells the story of my co-author and a very close friend of mine who actually went from being a gang leader to being a peacemaker and peace activist over the course of the past 15 years or so. And it sort of tells the story of what he had to do to sort of overcome the intergenerational trauma that he had experienced, and to break that cycle, while at the same time telling the story of this growing movement nationwide of all of these community activists who weren't necessarily banded up with the national movement. So it's a story of both the movement and of the individual.
That sounds incredible, Josh. You'll have to come back and hang out with us again to celebrate the book launch, because that sounds amazing.
Thank you.
So one last ask for you. You've dropped like crazy amounts of peak performance strategies for our listeners, but any kind of parting words of advice, suggestions, other strategies that you think the collective members benefit from hearing?
Yeah.
Some parting peak performance sage advice here.
So I guess the thing, I heard this interview with Elon Musk at one point. All things come back to Elon Musk, but no, I had this interview with him at one point. He was talking about Neuralink, the product. He was saying at a certain point, at a certain time, when the product is ready to go, they're basically going to be able to set whatever price they want for it, because the competitive advantage that it will provide for the people who use it versus the people who don't is going to be so astronomical that that it'll essentially pay for itself multiple times over. So this is, Elon Musk says a lot of things. We take all things with a grain of salt, but I would say I think that's a perfect analogy for how I feel about you all, right?
Wow.
And about FRC, because honestly, being able to the where it has helped position me in my career, I would not have gotten here on my own, and it has certainly paid for itself as of now. As of this interview, we'll check it again a year from now when the book is out, but as of now, it's paid for itself 3 times over, right? And so hopefully we can get that up to maybe 5.
Let's do it.
But that's my point, is it will more than pay for itself. This is an investment in yourself and your future and so on. And so that's what I would say to everybody, that would be my parting thing, is just take the course. And it would just sign up for one of them or all of them. But there is something, there is no way that this wouldn't benefit any of your listeners, in one way, shape, or form. So,
well, thank you. That's incredibly high praise, and I appreciate it. And we're incredibly grateful to have you as a member of the collective. And thank you for sharing some of the lessons you've learned along the way, and for hanging out with me. This has been so much fun.
I appreciate you, Tori. I do, and everything that you guys do.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks. And we'll be sure to put all of the ways that listeners can find you and learn more about you, learn more about R.O.I in the show notes. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again for your time, and take care.
Awesome. Thanks, Tori.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.